Yes, you read that right. An unlikely bunch of cobbled-together backmarkers saved Moto GP, and this is that story. Moto GP faced a serious problem in 2012. Suzuki had announced in 2011 that it wouldn't continue after another poor season. Kawasaki had long since left the grid in 2008. Other manufacturers such as Aprilia and KTM were uninterested in Moto GP. This meant that 2012 looked set to start with only 12 bikes, 4 apiece from Honda, Yamaha and Ducati. This would have been a PR disaster, so something needed to be done quickly. The solution came from the oddly named Claiming Rule Team class, or CRT. The plan was simple: pad out the grid with superbike-derived machines that would be far cheaper to build than the pure prototypes. They wouldn't interfere with the prototypes at the front of the pack, but at least the grid would have 20 or so bikes at the start of a race. To give them more chance of hanging on to the GP bikes, they were allowed to run 24 litres of fuel, 3 more than the GP bikes, and run twice as many engines, 12 at a season as opposed to 6. These were quite hefty concessions and would prove pivotal in MotoGP's future. So what does Claiming Rule Team mean? This is one of the strangest rules I've ever heard of, and I still don't really get it. However, I'll try and explain. If a factory team for any reason decided it wanted to get hold of a CRT engine or claim it, then for €15,000 they could have the bike rolled into the MotoGP technical garage after a race, where the CRT team's mechanics would strip the engine from the bike and hand it over to the factory and never see it again. The fact that the real cost of those engines would have been well above €50,000 seems to be lost on the rule makers. This concept originated in American racing. It was designed to keep costs low and racing closer by limiting the amount of investment and negating any super complicated designs, although in reality it turned out to be largely self-governing. It's unclear if a rival ever purchased an engine, and to be honest, I reckon a factory team would have been too proud to consider this. So what turned up at the first round in Qatar? Well, it was an odd assortment of thrown together machines, rapid updates and barely modified street bikes. My initial reaction in 2012 when I saw these bikes was, why don't they use the word superbike? Well, there were 2 reasons for this. 1, production-based frames were too soft for the super stiff Bridgestone tyres, and 2, production-based frames were banned anyway. So the bikes that appeared on the grid appeared to be Moto 2 frames with big engines bolted into them, whilst others were loosely based on superbikes but with frames heavily modified to increase rigidity. These seemed so far removed from the road-going versions that they got around the production rule. 7 teams entered that year full-time, with bikes from frame manufacturers like Suzuki, Iota and FTR. Kawasaki, Honda, Aprilia and even BMW provided highly modified production-based engines. While half the grid might have been hacked together, Aprilia was the first manufacturer to get involved in the new concept, bringing its ART GP12 machine for Randy DePugnier, Alicia Spargaro and Matteo Passini. Essentially a heavily modified, tuned and beefed up Aprilia RSV4 superbike, it was the first factory-supported effort on the grid. 6 teams received bikes from a production line much more akin to that used by the regular teams at the front of the grid, demonstrating that building a MotoGP machine for less money was possible. However, some bikes, like the Espansorama racing effort, really looked like they'd been knocked up in someone's shed. Their 2013 bike was recently sold at auction for around $35,000 by some remarkable coincidence at the time of this video. So, how did the CRT bikes get on? Well, despite having about a 35km deficit in top speed, the CRT bikes acquitted themselves quite well on their debut. Colin Edwards was the fastest in qualifying, only 3 seconds off pole and only 0.8 seconds behind Rossi, although Rossi was on that ill-fated Ducati. Colin won the class in the race, but was a whopping 58 seconds behind the winner, Jorge Lorenzo. By the end of the season, Aprilia had produced the best bike and finished 4th place in the Constructors' Championship, closer to Ducati on points than Ducati was to Yamaha in 2nd place. Whether that shows how bad the Ducati was or how good the Aprilia was, I'll leave that up to you to decide. For 2013, CRT would have softer tyres available, and all CRT bikes would now have to run electronics from Magneti Marelli further to reduce the performance gap to the GP bikes. You can tell now where Dorna was going with this. CRT teams also had more concessions, allowing them to test and develop the engines far more than the GP teams could during a season. The performance gaps to the full prototype machines decreased throughout the year. Simultaneously, poor little Italian team, otherwise known as Ducati, had been having a torrid time in MotoGP, and even with the great Valentino Rossi, it could not improve its performance. However, There were some smart people at Ducati, and none more so than engineering genius Gigi Dall'Igna. We all know now that Gigi is one of the brightest minds ever to be seen in MotoGP, and he was to prove this back then with a cunning plan to get Ducati back to the front. Already closely involved in supplying CRT bikes to the satellite teams, Gigi knew a tipping point had been reached regarding which rules were going to be more competitive. With more fuel, engines, softer tyres and lots more testing, CRT was now the way to go. The rules for the now named Open class for 2014 depended on using the standard ECU system, which Ducati realised they could help develop anyway. Therefore, Gigi played his trump card when he arrived at Ducati, immediately informing the Motorsport Manufacturers Association that for 2014, Ducati would abandon its factory status and elect to join the Open class. The other teams, particularly Honda, were not impressed by this. Honda was already preparing to make this move, but in a very different way, with the introduction of the ill-fated RCV 1000R, essentially a stripped-down RC 213V. Honda believed it was following the spirit of the rules by providing satellite teams with a lower cost and lower quality machine to bulk out the back of the grid, rather than using the rulebook to its advantage of its factory team as Dall'Igna was planning. This was the moment that the organisers had been waiting for. Only 1 week before Ducati's announcement, race director Mike Webb admitted the following: "Eventually we hope the factories will have their hand forced into saying, OK, we'll have to go with the open rules because it's the most competitive." However, the Japanese factories were disgruntled at what they saw as abusing the privateer spirit of the open class rules and feared a Ducati advantage. Ultimately, they have been outmaneuvered by not insisting on replacement wording to deter a factory to open class move when the claiming rule was dropped and the open class was created at the end of 2013. To settle this disgruntlement, the various parties thrashed out a compromise that saw an interim set of Factory 2 rules, which were factory teams but with results-based concessions. This would apply to Ducati and then later Suzuki and Aprilia for 2014 and 15, ultimately leading to the introduction of unified ECU software for all the teams in 2016. Webb confirmed that having the full MotoGP grid racing under the same open-based technical rules had always been the final target, but lamented that it had taken so long. "It has been incremental. We've had many interim years where we are trying to implement a final rule change. It should have been completed at once in 2012 when CRT was created. But it is not until the single ECU was introduced in 2016 that we can complete the whole job." So, for 2016, all bikes on the grid were essentially open-class bikes, with all the manufacturers having to use the same ECU software. When Ducati plugged the now mandatory Magneti Marelli system into its works bikes in 2016, it knew exactly what to expect, as it helped develop it. That marked the start of a resurgence for the brand, which saw Dovizioso finish runner-up in the Riders' Championship for 3 years in a row and finally win the title with Pecco Bagnaia in 2022. However, the reforms and concession status also had a sweeping impact across the grid, creating an unfair advantage for new teams willing to risk a go at MotoGP. Aprilia, able to upgrade its CRT project into a fully fledged Grand Prix effort, was the first to step up to the mark. The Suzuki returned, and even KTM decided to move up from Moto2, soon doubling the grid to 6 manufacturers. The newcomers were aided by not having to develop their electronics and being able to test all season long with prototype engines. At the same time, the established factories faced a season-long development freeze, and the rules that had grown out of CRT made an immediate impact. The 2016 season began with a grid of 21 bikes from Honda, Yamaha, Ducati, Suzuki and Aprilia and ended with KTM's MotoGP debut. The plan to get more manufacturers and privateers onto the grid had worked. The season, which also saw Michelin replacing Bridgestone as tyre supplier, produced the first MotoGP victories for satellite riders since 2006 and a record 9 different race winners from 4 manufacturers. It's safe to say that 2016 was a watershed year in MotoGP. Been a long road to get there, from the era of depleted grids, modified road bikes and unheard of riders barely qualifying for races. It's fair to say that the current rulebook born out of the CRT era has made MotoGP one of the most competitive race series in the world. Every one of you MotoGP fans should owe a special gratitude to that collection of crap bikes that made up the 2012 grid.